Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Noriko, for the comprehensive introduction. You have made my job a lot easier now, and as you will all know from experience, since there are many projects around the world, final conference often signifies that there's a real risk of looking back. This panel in particular is not meant to do that, but it's meant to look forward. And you got that sense already because we're in a post-Paris world. That's what Noriko started off with. So I'm going to actually spend much less time looking back, but more raise a couple of questions that I hope will be picked up again also by our other speakers in the rest of the session. So, no, that's not speaker. Yes. So just a quick rehash. As you know, this POLIMP is not a research project as such, but was a technical term as coordination and support action, meaning that we were trying to get at information and disseminate largely existing insights in a new way that would make it better accessible. And so the first thing that I want to show you is what the issues were that we were focusing on, because we went through a process of identifying knowledge needs with people through survey and interviews, and then prioritizing those, and then working through them and helping present them in new ways. And you've seen examples of this, the Climate Policy Info Hub, an online knowledge platform, the webinars series, and also the survey, just as a few examples. The topics that we ended up focusing on can be grouped a little bit around the two main issues that we're looking at overall: the international developments and EU policy. And of course, this is all influenced by the political process at the time. So we started that part of the project more than 2 years before Paris, and as it's hard to remind ourselves maybe now, but there was so much uncertainty about how this process was going to develop, where were the negotiations going to lead to, and so a big focus was scenarios for how that could happen. What would be the new specific mechanisms that might be developed at the UN level? What is the experience of existing mechanisms, not just everybody thinks usually about CDM, JI, etc., but also technology needs assessment, for example, is one topic. How are they going to make it into a post-Paris world? And of course, big focus at the time, what is the impact of what's happening elsewhere on what is happening in Europe? Or how far can Europe go in a state of uncertainty about what's happening globally? Because the conversation then, for a long time, certainly 2013, 2014, was much under the impression of the discussion at EU level about the future targets, 2030 targets. What are the cost implications? What is the future of key mechanisms that have been the backbone of delivering and over-delivering right now on our 2020 targets, including the EU emissions trading system, but also the support for renewables and the costs of these technologies. So those were key topics, and I'm already hinting at the fact that, of course, the focus shifted over time as we were going through the implementation of the project, and we tried to adjust and bring in these other issues. Now, post-Paris, indeed, the situation is dramatically different to some extent at the international level. While there is still quite a lot of uncertainty about how the specifics of Paris and the new system post-2020 will work out, a few things still to be elaborated and negotiated at a technical level, but a lot of it also depending about how the politics of the push from Paris, the positive signal, will pan out. There is an overall signal of the UNFCCC system being strengthened. At the EU level, the targets have been decided in the meantime, and the focus is shifting towards policy design. On the ETS, a lot of energy was expended on debating what to do with the surplus. We now have a decision on the MSR. We have the proposal, but this is all sort of ongoing. We have also had a rather fundamental decision on the nature of the renewable energy support in Europe, with the change from having binding national renewable energy targets to now these being only binding, or that target only being binding at the EU level. And that despite the fact that there's been such a success in reducing the cost for these technologies. And as all of those of you, and I think there's probably 90% of the room based in Brussels, the energy union is the pervading theme and the core discourse on energy and climate policy, certainly in the year before Paris. So in terms of our insights, Noriko just covered extensively some of the issues on specific topics that came up in stakeholder engagement. I'll try to be very brief on those and then get to my questions for the future. So one of the things that we experienced was, despite there being still a lot of interest in the potential and the future developments in the international system, there's really a growing sort of delinking between those, or there was at least, a growing disconnection between those mechanisms and direct decisions on EU policy. The targets had to be decided prior to Paris. The cords between the international offset mechanisms and EU targets had been severed largely. And while there's still a growing engagement or intense engagement and policy expertise on what's happening in the UNFCCC, there's surely a lot of UNFCCC nerds in the audience here. You will all know that the impact of those topics on deciding specifics in national and EU climate policy is not always very strong. The great level of diversity in opinions on stakeholders was something that Noriko again alluded to, and so I'm not actually going to focus on those issues anymore. The fact that there is this diversity is not news. Claire Dupont asked in the morning, sort of, how did you deal with these sort of national differences in opinion? And I think they became they were prominent in our engagement with the stakeholders, but also there's a great diversity in opinions among stakeholders regardless of their national origin. And so the overall question is rather, I think, where is majority of discourse and how found and how are decisions taken in such a context. So on to the forward-looking questions. And I'm putting this all into the context of an overarching headline of, is there going to be a Paris effect that will help reinvigorate EU policy? And here I'm keeping my fingers crossed that there is, but still pose it as a question. I don't have to go through all the details. We have a reference to 1.5 degrees that wasn't expected. We have the long-term dimension is very strong in Paris. And while at the EU level we've had this formulation of aiming at 80 to 95% reduction by 2050 for many years now, and so the long-term dimension has been there, it has actually not featured too strongly. And there's a real question, you all know, the roadmap was meant to be a new element that would help usher in more of a conversation on the long-term dimension, but then it got bogged down in the fact that there couldn't be agreement on raising the 2020 targets. So now, part of the question, what will this do to EU processes on the long term? Do we get a new process to talk about the long term, and how that impacts, of course, also the current sets of targets? There is this very clear review and 5-year review cycle in Paris. We don't have that in EU climate policy in this form right now. So that is a new impulse. We are already having a conversation on changing the governance system for 2030. Dimitrios alluded to that earlier in the context of agreeing on the national sharing of the renewables targets. This may also be a point in time about thinking about whether we need to rethink the way that EU policy is organized with regards to the targets. At least it presents an opportunity as we are changing and reforming our systems for 2030, and as we have that impulse from Paris. There is going to be a question about whether, what the future role of the EU will be in the international sphere. There are some hints at potential risks that the EU might not be at the table, at the first, CMA, right? I'm not going to do the whole COP mob, etc. You know what I mean. So first Paris conference. At the same time, I think the press announcement went out today about the high-level support from the EU at the signing ceremony in New York. So, you know, this is, I think, as I'm saying, I'm posing this as a question. You know, what is the EU role? How strong, how visible is it going to be, despite and because of its internal conflicts? And then, of course, the ETS. You know, we've been sort of doctoring and changing things in a way that could be substantial, but it's hard to tell at the moment. How things are shaping up right now, there's a real likelihood, and I would think that's a potential risk, that the focus of the debate on the future of the ETS will be about impacts on industry. And that could really divert from the fact, you know, how are we making most use of this instrument? And then I think the Energy Union is really sort of an interesting tool and framework to think about how it might be able to help us overcome some of the issues that we also saw in the course of the POLIMP project. We seem to be having a tension here where there's a trend towards member states wanting to reassert their national sovereignty over energy mixes, certainly when it comes to renewables. And that's not just the UK, it's other countries also. But at the same time, we have this growing actual reality of integration on the infrastructure side, also for renewables, and we have a real need, if we want to deploy these technologies more, that stronger European integration is absolutely necessary. So, you know, is this concept, this new way of trying to think about finding a framework for talking about and mediating issues on energy and climate policy in the EU, does it have the potential to help us overcome that tension? Because it somehow needs to be resolved. I will stop right here, and I'm really looking forward to the inputs that are still to come. Thank you very much.